Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing our look at Operation Husky. And if you've been following the previous shows, one of the things that has come up a lot is the planning, the preparation, aerial reconnaissance, things like that. And integral to that subject in building up information about the landing sites is what we're going to be talking about today. Anyway, we have two members of the Malta Command World War II Living History Group with us who will talk a little about what they do as a living history group and then the COPP units that were in Malta preparing for Operation Husky. So I'll bring the guys in now. So Kurt and Colin. So good evening, guys. How are you today?
Good
Fine,
evening.
thank you.
Fine,
Good evening
thanks.
to you all.
So, at first glance, Malta, obviously it's come up in every conversation about Husky because it was so much about the preparation and planning and things like that. But do you find that as members of the Living History Group, you'd rather talk? Is the story of Malta as Malta more interesting, or as Malta as a stepping stone for going on to Husky in Sicily? Because it's the two things. There's the story of Malta, then there's then it's its importance later on. Which bit interests you, each of you, or is it all equally interesting to you?
Shall I
Colin, you
answer?
can.
Shall I answer it? Okay.
Yes.
So, from a reenactment point of view, obviously for us, it's from the beginning of the war, which is important, till the day that Malta kept active in the Second World War. So for us, Malta was and is a strategic point. The fact that obviously, although sometimes we do underestimate ourselves the importance of Malta, being a small island in the middle of the Mediterranean, one has to understand how vital the island was, and no wonder that Winston Churchill called Malta the unsinkable aircraft carrier. And there was a reason for it. Obviously, if we had to go to the next stage, yes, Operation Husky. Again, was an important, in my opinion, even more important than Operation Overlord, because it was the test trial for the first invasion from one country to another. And so for us, both, to answer your question, yes, both elements are important for us.
Okay. And the other thing we were just talking before going live, and perhaps Kurt can answer this one, is that a lot of the people watching this, the Brits and Americans watching this, of course they're aware of Malta's importance in World War II, but it's the convoy, Spitfires, and George Cross, and I'm assuming even within Malta, your average person, they're probably the big stories people know about. But as you will be telling us about tonight, and as hopefully we'll bring you back in future shows, there's a lot more to Malta than those things, those three things there. But are they the things that everybody knows generally?
Well, also adding to what Colin said, even though we're at the point where we might underestimate the military might of Malta during the Second World War, even though initially Malta was under-equipped and not supplied enough, because at first the thought about Malta being in the Mediterranean, the risks weren't that considered that high until eventually the fascist regime joined in part of the Axis, and eventually Malta became a hotspot for the Axis, and eventually the Allies, then the British part, started considering Malta as more important. So yes, I think there are still some points of our history, World War II military history, that might still be missing. One of them, in fact, is COPP.
Yeah.
But it's not only COPP. There are small bits and pieces, stories which even cover Maltese infantry, Maltese-British collaboration, small units operating from the island, and even, in fact, during my research on COPP, I've managed to even pinpoint a particular mission which was carried by the SAS. I actually didn't know that the SAS operated from the island during the invasion when there was an interest in invading Pantelleria. So, yeah, there are bits and pieces of our history which are either still not yet given the proper importance or light to actually show what Malta did. Located in the Mediterranean, a strategic point, served millions and of regimes and other nations which actually were under the control of Malta, and eventually the Second World War doesn't even Sometimes we don't even consider that. Sometimes there are other important points which we need to speak about. One of them is COPP, in fact.
Well, there we are. We're going to be talking about that later on. So you've got your PowerPoint, and it's a fantastic one, folks. So we'll do some questions. If they're big questions about Malta in World War II or about the living history aspect, we'll do those big ones at the end of the show. But I promise you there's lots of information coming your way. But if you have a pertinent question about one of the slides, there's some about weapons later on. So if you've got a particular question about a weapon or about a uniform or about one of the aspects that Kurt's telling us about, we'll deal with them, as many of them as we can as we go along. More recently, folks, as you noticed, I've not been able to answer all your questions. Otherwise, the shows will be on for 3 or 4 hours. But we'll answer as many of them as we can that are good. But basically, I'm going to hand over to my two guests now, Kurt and Colin, to take us through this presentation. So living history and COPP, and a bit about what they do as a group. So over to you two guys.
So basically, Colin, you can start.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Once again, just a brief history about how we started and from where we started. We started way back in February 2006. We were 2 founder members, being myself and the late Godwin Hampton, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. And we are currently 18 reenactors, which we are, all of us are military collectors, and also we also have an interest in the history per se. Being Maltese, obviously, we give prominence to the 2 Maltese regiments. One of them was the infantry regiment, known as the King's Own Malta Regiment, and the other one was the artillery regiment, known as the Royal Malta Artillery. So predominantly, that is our forte in what we represent. However, in order to expand on the knowledge and also give an array of different units when we do our displays, we went into other units that had connection to Malta and the Mediterranean. And basically, these units are, we do Royal Air Force with particular reference to one of the squadrons, which is 185, and we chose 185 because it was the only RAF squadron that, believe it or not, had a Maltese logo at the bottom. We also do Royal Navy. Obviously, Malta was the hub of the Royal Navy. We also do LRDGs. We also do Malta Home Guard, and we also do 1st Battalion Border Regiment and Paras. What is our mission? Our mission is not only just to display our uniforms, but the bottom line is to educate the public about Malta and World War II, and also primarily is that we try and always keep in our memories our forefathers and ancestors. What do? We do participate in local historical events. We at times are invited by local councils when they have certain activities. We do activities between us within our units. We also are invited to go abroad, as we have a very close connection with the UK with 2 particular groups. One of them is the RAF group, another one is an artillery group, and we are also invited to participate in filming and also documentaries. Perhaps, Kurt, we can go on to the other slide if there's anything. So that is in a nutshell what we do and what we don't, just as a matter of interest. We all come from different walks of life. We have people who are employed in the army, like Kurt himself is a lieutenant. We have people who are also employed with the civil protection. We have people who were employed with the police force. Myself, I come from a financial background, and we have people who work in museums. So the interest is all there, and the more there is a mix, the more knowledge is put, as they say, into the pot, which makes it even more interesting. We have no age. We have the youngest member at the moment is 15 years old, and the oldest member is close to 70. I only believe in one mission. As long as you have a passion and interest in the subject, then hop along and you can join our group. The only thing I always maintain is discipline and also perfection. Why? If you're going to represent a group, you either do it right or don't do it at all. From my part, as an introduction, I think I've said enough, and I would like to pass the floor to Kurt, where he will now start giving us a detailed explanation of his very well intense research he has conducted these past 2 years.
So I can start, Paul.
Yep.
So thank you for finding a slot for us today, and I welcome all the viewers. So basically, our main topic today will be the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties. I will be giving a brief history of how they originated, basically how they developed, and most importantly, the connection of the COPPs to Malta. It's important to note that COPP were not only linked to Malta, although initially they officially kickstarted their operations from Malta. Later on, we'll touch a bit those parts of history. Later on, they continued to serve on other fronts, such as D-Day and even in the Pacific Theatre of War. I do love quotes, and even though it's not a military quote, it's still a British scientist, the famous Charles Darwin. I inserted this quote simply because the history, the mission of COPP was literally about change. They had to adapt to a lot of change in a very, very short period of time. Massive amount of training, massive amount of knowledge. COPP was literally set up at a very fast pace, in a very speedy way. By the end of December 1942, start of 1943, the Allies were focusing all their energies on the Mediterranean. So all of a sudden, COPP became something. So it's about these men adapting to sudden changes. Unfortunately, the initial losses were quite problematic, but as we'll soon see, this quote, in my opinion, reflects quite a lot who COPP were. This is a slide showing basically the what we'll be discussing. Who were COPP? We'll get through COPP, how they became active and running, their organization and training. There was a lot of training. There was a lot of organization involved, even though what you see here on the slides, Wilmot, which is the person we'll be discussing soon, responsible for COPP, even though he did not define exactly initially what COPP would entail later on, because there were so many changes. These people were learning a lot from this new project, you can say, from this secret unit, that things you see on these slides changed gradually as time passed by. But Malta was mainly their first stepping stone. We'll be discussing also the equipment. Colin then will be discussing the uniforms related to COPP. Then we'll continue further on COPP and their arrival in Malta, which will be divided into parts: the early part of 1943, then mid-1943, prior to July, prior going to Husky. Then we can have some time dedicated to questions. There will be also some part, which will also be done by Colin, where we'll be describing a reconstruction of an actual original COPP canoe, which we've managed to source from our sister island, Gozo, and we'll go also through that. So let's basically kickstart with the origins of COPP. Who was responsible for COPP? Basically, COPP was Nigel Cloxton's Wilmot responsibility. He was a naval officer, okay? And as a naval officer, he came up with the idea of creating the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties. Initially, the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties weren't recognized officially to operate as COPP. So we'll be tackling and discussing certain missions like, for example, recce missions, which although were not officially under the designation of COPP, they still took place. They were still recognized, but for a very short period of time. So they were like experimental missions. But why create COPP? Why this idea of creating beach reconnaissance? Basically, Paul, do you mind, please? Would it be possible to upload a new presentation, because I had an updated one? Do you mind, please?
This is your one. It's the one you updated.
Yes, but I need to update with a new version, if you don't mind, because
Okay,
unfortunately
sure.
I'm Sorry for this.
No problem. That's no problem at all. So, folks, just while Kurt's doing that, just to remind you that next week is going to be Philippines week on World War II TV. I'm just getting the show scheduled right now, and then after that, I'm away for about 10 days to the south of France, looking at some things over there. Well, the west of France, and then after Philippines week, we're doing a Net Pacific Actions week, and then it gets lots and lots of stuff all through into late August and September. But so if you are new to World War II TV, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to consider becoming a channel member, and of course, always the information you need is in the comment in the description below. That's where you'll find links to the Living History groups, their Facebook page, etc., etc. So there we are. I've done a bit of housekeeping while
I apologize, but unfortunately, the website kept the old version, and I had to update it with the new one. I apologize.
We're fine. We're good. We're back on course.
So yeah, basically, as I was saying, why come up with this concept of beach reconnaissance? Basically, the idea goes back to World War I, when Nigel Cloxton's uncle, he called as Uncle Wilmot, he experienced the landings in Turkey, the Gallipoli landings, and basically from then on, he passed on the information to Wilmot, where eventually the British military from that point onward started to experience problems associated to beach landings. And one major thing that the British lacked was understanding landing zones. In fact, the Gallipoli landings, unfortunately, resulted in a lot of casualties. When Wilmot was, through his naval career during the Second World War, as a ship officer, was experiencing early war, beach landing zones, beach landing of troops, unfortunately, they were either inefficient, high rate of casualties, or there was not enough proper understanding of the beaches associated with landing troops. So in order to efficiently retrieve more information to understand geographical data and carry out beach surveys, Nigel Wilmot came up with this idea of creating a beach reconnaissance unit. In fact, during his time when he was stationed in Egypt, and simultaneously there was his good old friend, Major Roger Courtney, which also had this interest later on. In fact, Roger Courtney, I do remember that in the past you had a podcast concerning the SBS, and Major Roger Courtney was the highlight of that podcast. And in fact, he worked quite in tandem with Wilmot, because Roger Courtney was the man behind the use of canoes. And when Wilmot and Roger met in Egypt, basically they came up with the idea of combining both and delve into beach reconnaissance. And in fact, as I was saying, at the time there wasn't enough information about beaches, so they were just selecting zones from maps to the information or aerial reconnaissance, and that's it. They would choose these zones and let the troops. In fact, basically, one could see the Degabriele. The Degabriele had in its initial successful events, but later on during the landings it was quite a disaster. And in fact, that's where COPP would fit in. But it was not only the Degabriele. Later on, in the same year, 1942, which we'll be also speaking about this soon, there was Operation Torch, and in fact, Wilmot had a part in this, and wanted to prove that if you would have these people being dispatched, operating before the landing of the troops, if these people would be present to guide the right the assets to the right landing zones, this would prove to be much more efficient with less casualty rates. Eventually, what happened is that Roger Courtney and Wilmot started to try and influence the right people to actually reach their goal. And in fact, although Roger Courtney later went up to set up the SBS and he also had the Special Service Brigade, Wilmot still tried to put pressure to try and fit in somewhere with his special unit of beach reconnaissance. In fact, in 1941, when Roger Courtney and Wilmot for the first time carried out their beach reconnaissance on the islet of Rhodes, this was the first stepping stone for Wilmot because, as I've said, then Courtney continued to set up SBS, still supporting Wilmot through the years, as we'll also mention, lending him people from the SBS to help COPP. But during the Rhodes raid, Wilmot and Courtney experienced the first beach reconnaissance. The Allies were interested in occupying Rhodes, liberating Rhodes. Although it was very risky, nearly fatal, the reconnaissance was successful. They've managed with poor training, with poor equipment. They did not have anything, just merely the basic equipment necessary, which they could manage to find. But eventually, later on, COPP delved into gearing up with quite a specialized number of equipment. But initially, this was their first stepping stone. Through the years, from 1941 then up to 1942, basically, we have kudu inhuman. One would ask, what kind of terms, what kind of wording is this? In fact, they chose some form of secret, so to say, difficult terms just to hide their presence. At this point, COPP was still not official, but Wilmot already had some volunteers. Roger Courtney helped out, even he had volunteers from the SBS. They still managed to, find these slots in history to try and prove that using canoes, carrying out beach reconnaissance, one can eventually get somewhere. And in fact, in 1942, the Kudu inhuman, which involved some of the men which would later on would form part of COPP, such as, for example, one would see Lieutenant Teacher and Lieutenant Harg, which were part of COPP later on, were part of this team, and they were dispatched to carry out beach reconnaissance on the North African beaches before Operation Torch. Some of the recce missions were quite successful, but some others weren't, simply because there was a lack of proper understanding what would actually happen during the mission itself, poor equipment, and even it was difficult because the weather unfortunately did not allow some recce missions to take place properly. So what was happening is some men were put to the test, but the test wasn't being fulfilled. So high up the chain, high up Naval Command, they were trying to understand, why do we actually need these people? You had the SBS, you had the Special Service Brigade. Why do you actually need further units? They were risky, of course. You could lose men easily, and in fact, that's what happened. The fate in having a beach reconnaissance unit was quite poor. But eventually, after the successes of Operation Torch, the mentality changed drastically, because Wilmot had one key figure in his favor, and that was Mountbatten. Mountbatten was interested in the unit. He was interested to a point that by the end of 1942, December 1942, Wilmot was immediately requested to start setting up a unit. And in fact, moving on to the next slide, by the end of 1942, there was enough pressure placed on the Naval Command that by Lord Louis Mountbatten himself, and COPP eventually formed. Even though we say that they were formed in 1942, officially they became operational as COPP in 1943. So that's the relevance in the 80 years anniversary, together with that of Husky. And in fact, Wilmot had to set up COPP. And it was quite an overkill, I have to say, because by 1942, December 1942, and on February 1943, they became operational within such a short period of time, with what Wilmot was already jotting down as notes, and with what he was already thinking of organizing. He had to draft everything on paper and eventually present it to the right people to show off that COPP could actually work, and we can start deploying this top secret unit into action. In fact, in a nutshell, basically, he divided the organization into the logistical part and the structural part, even though he included a lot of information which eventually is impossible to present on this presentation. through the years it changed. The people, the men of COPP, they adapted to the changes, to what they've experienced, to what they've passed through. COPP changed eventually as time passed. In fact, up till 1944, the changes were so massive that what you find in books jotted down by Wilmot, most of them did not follow, because what I've said initially, what we've seen on these slides, is basically the initial part of what Wilmot suggested, but later on things changed quite a lot. Wilmot exhibited a strong desire, excuse me for that, Wilmot exhibited a strong desire to have naval officers in charge of COPP. One would simply ask why? Because they were the people experienced at sea. If you have to task someone at sea, they were the right people to actually go into COPP, readily trained as either a navigator or hydrographer. They would have very skillful hands-on and a very well idea of how to operate at sea, and eventually they would be the main people, the main reference person when commandeering a unit or when taking or handling a COPP group. Eventually he divided COPP into various groups. We'll soon see a timeline. But Wilmot did not only limit it to COPP naval officers, because there was the SBS, as we've mentioned earlier. Courtney still supported Wilmot up till the end. In fact, there were SBS commandos available in Malta. Roger Courtney lended SBS personnel to Wilmot to help him out, since they were already gaining experience from their own missions. But there was also the army part. We can see Royal Engineers participating. One would also ask, why Royal Engineers? Because they were experts in handling special equipment, and even, as we'll soon see, the training involved a lot of tactical engineering whilst operating on a beach. So it wasn't only officers, but you also had other ranks operating from other branches of service. So one thing that we need to appreciate about COPP, that even though it was set quite fast and ad hoc, it combined a multidisciplinary approach when it operated on the field. So that's quite important, as we'll see through the groups being organized and the different people involved. There was obviously the Royal Navy Reserve, the Royal Navy Voluntary Reserve, and these were voluntarily joining Wilmot to help set COPP and literally go in for a risky adventure.
Just got a question for you, Kurt.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
David O'Keefe. So it's all about the fighting Wilmot is doing to get this unit set up. So David O'Keefe, the eminent professor of history in Canada, is saying, how much support did they get from the new director of naval intelligence, Rushbrook, compared to Godfrey? Because to get one of these kind of organizations off the ground, you need support of some big players. And that people were talking in the sidebar about the fact that a lot of these sort of special forces that have been around since 1940, they're all about kind of blowing things up and killing people, which is fine, but often those missions don't work. But there's this kind of evolution towards the intelligence side of things, and you need support from intelligence. So what was how much support did they get from Rushbrook is the question.
To be honest, plainly, I during my research, I never came across naval intelligence being involved, but I might be wrong. In fact, these names, I've never seen them being mentioned. To be honest, their main point of reference was Lord Mountbatten, because rather than intelligence as such being involved, it was more Mountbatten dealing directly with the naval directors.
Okay.
But with regards to intelligence, from my point of view and from my end, I've never came across these officers being involved directly in providing support. All I can say basically is they've tried to branch out and try to retrieve support not only from the naval part, but even from the Air Force part and even from civilian departments, especially for the canoe part, but we'll be mentioning that later. But with regard to naval intelligence, I've never came across those two names specifically being involved directly with their setup.
I suppose if you've got Mountbatten involved, you don't need anybody else. I suppose if Mountbatten is in your corner, that's good enough. But
yes, in fact, initially Mountbatten, as you well know, Mountbatten supported quite a lot of commandos stuff, and in fact, COPP were involved also with commando training and with all the nitty-gritties related to commando. But I think what happened with COPP is that the idea was there, and when the opportunity came up, COPP was set up to deal with those opportunities.
Yep.
And more likely, COPP was also used to experiment new tech, new stuff, because amazingly enough, COPP were given quite a lot of techie stuff, quite a lot of new technology to test on the field, like some other commando units. But coming to think of it, we'll soon see that, for example, COPP even deployed and operated specially modified chariot assets from the island of Malta, specifically to be utilized to carry out seabed reconnaissance and surveying on Sicily. One thing that I didn't even know, and I never knew, that chariots actually operated from the island. So rather than just the intelligence part, there was also the technological part being introduced into COPP. There was a lot of trial and error involved, unfortunately, with a lot of deaths involved, deaths of good men, good officers, which was part and parcel of the process. And in fact, one would thought, now we'll be describing it soon, one would have thought COPP that would be the end of it, just the initial missions from Malta, and Wilmot could pack up and go back to London. But in fact, it wasn't that. Fate wanted something different for Wilmot, and literally COPP became an experimental unit. In fact, by the end of the war, it was then disbanded. But I think COPP served quite a lot to act as the spine for modern military and for modern deployment of assets like canoes in tandem with SBS operations. And so, yeah, I think that would be my feedback on that kind of question.
Okay, brilliant. Well, let's back to you. We're loving it, so keep on going.
Yeah, so basically with regards to the submarines part, because one important point that Wilmot mentioned during his paperwork when he presented how COPP would operate, one big question was how COPP would be deployed on the field. They would reach their target location, they would be based, let's say in this case, Malta, but how would they reach Sicily? And eventually, that's where the canoe came in, because combining a submarine with a canoe can fit in a submarine, the submarine can sail towards the desired location, chosen location, they can be deployed from the submarine, they would about 2 miles, roughly, but then eventually they would continue their mission via canoe. But the submarine was the sea asset chosen specifically to deploy COPP. And in fact, we'll be mentioning submarines and canoes quite a lot in this presentation. Once they would be deployed from the submarine, then they would reach, they would paddle towards their target beach. And in fact, the pair, one canoe would take a pair of COPP members, one would act as the surveyor and the other would act as the pilot. And then they would reach their target beach by swimming, disembarking the canoe and swimming towards the target beach, and then the recce or the beach surveying would commence. In a nutshell, it would have taken 3 to 4 hours at night. That's very important. It took place at night, and the weather had to be ideal, so to allow COPP members to be able to work. Eventually, everything was carried out under stealth conditions. What was the final result? The final result was basically the Royal Navy part and the combined operations part. Combining them together, combined operations, pilotage parties became a reality. But eventually, these people, the COPP members, once now they have officially been formed, they had to be based somewhere. Being a top secret unit, being an innovative unit, moving away and acting away from the public eye, the chosen location, the chosen top secret location was Hayling Island. Okay, Hailing Island, as you can see from my slide, is located on the bottom part of the peninsula. And basically, Sandy Point, the yacht sailing club at Sandy Point was chosen. Why was this location chosen? It was a location close to Portsmouth, but besides that, besides the naval support, etc., one important point is it was remote, away from the public eye, and even, as you can see in my next slide, Sandy Point had this yacht club, which was requisitioned specifically, and as you can see, it was surrounded by sand. The shingle structure was very ideal to allow COPP to be able to train to use their canoes and eventually be able to train to carry out beach surveying and beach reconnaissance training. It also offered quite a lot of space to be able to store their early kit, their early canoes, because further down the line we'll be discussing how the canoes came to be and the most favored canoe to be used by COPP. But Sandy Point, allowing COPP to operate top secretly, it offered the ideal conditions to actually be able to carry out the right and proper training. Was it only Sandy Point that the training took place? No, of course not. These people had to be trained in other areas related to combined operations, related to commando training. So there was HMS Armadillo, Achnakerry involved, which eventually offered quite a lot of training in a very short period of time. But eventually, the training program was developed into a much more upgraded program, and later on, later COPP groups received much better, much sustained training, because the early groups, as we'll see when they were operating from Malta, suffered a high rate of casualties simply because things were rushed. So I will leave this part to Colin, where basically he will be going through the uniforms which were associated with COPP, both used outside of Malta and in Malta. Just a small point, there are sources of information which most of the time refer to the summer uniform, because most of the time COPP operated during the summer days. So the KDs were quite popular. Although there may not be a definitive model of uniform, what you're going to see today basically is what could have been, or what could have been adapted by COPP both during summer and during winter operations. Off to you, Colin.
Thank you, Kurt. So as Kurt introduced this section of uniforms, one has to understand the high temperatures that our island suffers during the summer months. So the basic uniform for all the services, as you all know, was the KD uniform. So it was a practical uniform. You had an Airtex shirt, breathable shirt, a pair of shorts. When it was trousers, it was always in KD. The first section, we're dealing with an officer. You have a KD shirt, KD shorts, long KD socks, and the normal officers' black Oxford shoes. And the one has to as well notice that there is a cap cover on the Royal Navy officer's cap, which was in line with KD. You know that there were two cap covers. You had the white when you are away from your home waters, and when you're in the tropical regions, you had a KD cover. Officers, so basically that's the uniform for summer months. Then you had obviously the chief petty officer, which was exactly, you could either wear trousers or shorts, exactly the same like the officers, with the only difference is a difference in the cap badge denoting the rank, whether that it was a chief petty officer. The third section is when we will see now a seaman. Obviously, seamen wearing the white rig square top, basically common with all Royal Navy personnel. You have the sailor's cap with the cap tally HMS, KD shorts, plimsolls, which was a very comfortable working shoes used by especially the commandos. They found it very useful in training, especially when they were also doing rock climbing. Not only that, it was only proven very good in the desert as it didn't leave any marks, footprints in the sand. Next slide, please, Kurt. Now we have, and then, a seaman in combat uniform, again, the summer months, wearing the square rig. You have the KD shorts, this time with ammo boots. You have hose tops and puttees, again, basic uniform of the British Army in World War II. He has as a weapon the Sten gun Mark II, which was one of the most common submachine guns used by the commandos, and you have the 37 pattern webbing. The one on the right is a leading seaman, this time in more temperate climate, wearing the denims. Denims, especially in the Mediterranean region, were found to be the most comfortable attire rather than the very woolen battle dress, which overheated sometimes the personnel and found to be very, very uncomfortable. Although it was made to be as overalls over the battle dress, many soldiers, if you read accounts, especially on Operation Husky, they literally discarded the BD uniform and went for the denims. In this case, you have commando training in denims. Next slide, please. We come to the winter attire. Battle dress, army battle dress was standard issue for the COPs. You have standard BD blouse, standard BD trousers, anklets with ammo boots. Officers used to wear, obviously, the basic officer set, which you have the 37 pattern pistol holster and also the ammo pouch. Officers denoting with shirt and tie, however, retaining the Royal Naval insignia. And this is, one has to know this, the Royal Naval insignia was always kept. So in this case, in the first slide, that's Kurt himself representing sub-lieutenant. As insignia, as the shoulder title, we have the Royal Navy, early, white on blue, with the tombstone combined operations badge, which was the first version before they went in late 44 to the round badge. Chief Petty Officer, again identical to the officer. Once again, the only difference is the cap badge. We go down the route now to the seaman. This case, leading seaman. As you can see, the far right picture, you have the Royal Navy insignia, which was worn on the sailor's uniform, identical, except with the addition of the title Royal Navy to distinguish that it's actually Royal Navy personnel, square rig under the battle dress to maintain, together with the cap, that he is Royal Naval personnel. Do we have another slide, please, Kurt? Now, full training. As Kurt a couple of minutes ago mentioned, every COP had to undergo commando training. In fact, Kurt and myself had the experience last year of visiting Aknakari, and we really understood the hardcore training that these people went through.
You guys from Malta going to Aknakari, did you nearly die of the cold?
No, it was very beautiful weather. I think it was in April, right, Kurt, when we went?
Yes, it was actually beautiful considering moving from 45 degrees to that splendid cold. It's good.
Yeah. You must have had the one good week.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it was one hell of a week, yes.
Very impressive. I mean, these people, I can't see today's generation. I'm not being degrading here, but they were a tough bunch. When these people, the type of training they went through, it was unbelievable, especially at such a young age. In fact, there was a sign that when you enter the training grounds of Aknakari, you had even a grave. So your first indication is, will I make it? This is another colleague of ours in the unit, Andreas, and here he is in full battle order, as you can see, with full kit, ready for action as part of the training. In a nutshell, I covered the different types of uniforms that this unit made use of in their everyday life. Kurt, back to you.
Just another small point, there is from literature sources of information showing that when Courtney landed SBS personnel, because the importance of the patches identification is prominent within the British military, Courtney in fact insisted that his people should still keep on wearing SBS patches. So you would have seen a mix and match. Dress code, most probably, especially in the tropics part and even in Malta, literature also shows that it was literally kept up to KDs with no form of identification to secretly keep COPP personnel hidden away or even not to be questioned by the public. But we'll soon tackle that nearly at the end of the slides, when we'll be discussing a particular officer individual who actually wrote a book, which I happily have managed to buy a copy of his autobiography, showing quite a lot of details during his stay in Malta and whilst operating from Malta as a COPP officer. So,
just a quick question for you, Kurt. Did they recruit from men already in the Royal Navy, or did they recruit straight from conscription?
Well, basically, in fact, that's why I was going to point out in this slide, Royal Navy officers were primarily recruited to act as commanding officers, but recruitment was purely voluntarily. So many officers, luckily, joined Wilmot to act as officers voluntarily, to form COPP. Some other ranks were actually also recruited voluntarily, so it wasn't necessarily officers that were recruited. Why? Because some of the other ranks, they had skilled jobs. They came from a naval background. For example, some of the other ranks' job was literally to act as maintenance personnel at Sandy Point and at Hailing Island, or even a company COPP to help in maintenance and repairs. And in fact, this list shows the initial ideal organization of COPP, which eventually changed throughout time, because one would see that different COPP groups had different types of people, different types of personnel. For example, you would not always have a draftsman, or some of them would be missing. Some groups would be larger than others. So they were all arranged according to the theater of operations, according to the missions. Like, for example, in Malta, you would have seen a lot of officers, because initially Wilmot had a lot of officers volunteering and forming COPP, even pre-COPP. So in Malta, you would have seen a lot of officers. One would also see that later on in 1944, COPP still operated on the base of officers. But some other ranks also were based in Hailing Island to support COPP during their training programs. A multidisciplinary team. So primarily you had one lieutenant, which acted as the commanding officer of a group of men of COPP. It was either a navigator hydrographer. A commanding officer was required to be an experienced officer. So usually, like we'll see later on, Lieutenant Stanbury, which was in Malta, he had a vast previous experience, pre-war and since the start of the war, training within the Navy. So he was experienced as a naval officer. So primarily commanding officers had to be experienced. Then usually would have another lieutenant, which acted as an assistant to the commander, and usually it could be both the commanding officer. That's how risky and that's how open they were. Usually you could have seen the commanding officer and the assistant to the CEO operating on the mission. They wouldn't literally have stayed at base and just commandeered. They would actually go on the mission themselves. That's how much COPP was open to the job. Royal Engineers were involved. In this case, Wilmot had specified Commando SBS, but you had Royal Engineers from the Army forming part of COPP. They usually offered the technical support in addition to beach reconnaissance, and also a much more understanding and experienced hands-on when landing on the beaches for the reconnaissance. You could have an engineer doing the reconnaissance rather than a naval officer, but that's why the training program was launched in such a way that it would cover each and every person from top to bottom. Seaman ratings, they could have been used, in fact, up to a PO to act as the pilots, where they would literally handle the canoe, paddle the canoe close to the target beach. They would wait for the surveyor, but also they themselves would be able to man certain equipment, transmitting equipment, and even they themselves would be able to take some information, carry out some recce information from the canoe if it was required or could take place. Another seaman rating would have been acting as a spare or a maintenance mate, because canoes had to be repaired, especially the early models. There were electrical people and maintenance people, petty officers. These was usually either in large or small numbers, either based at HQ or deployed with a COPP group. A corporal sergeant, a paddler guard was also specified by Wilmot, but not always included. The draftsman might have been needed due to the canoes being used and also usually at base, and the writer usually was also based at Hailing Island. Maybe they would have been present, with or deployed with teams. But for example, in Malta, I've never managed to source a writer being present. Maybe later on, but not in Malta.
And is that a writer to record the history to record the activities, or is it a writer to put down information being gathered by other people?
Yes, the writer usually did that job, but one important thing to mention about COPP is, luckily, the information present out there, especially I'm mentioning particularly Ian Tranauden's work, when he was actually writing his book about COPP, he managed to interview COPP members which were still alive post-war. So primary sources of information were at best. And that would have definitely helped him understand and helped him publish. And for us to be here today to actually present more about COPP. But eventually then from books you will end up researching more paperwork and searching for more stuff from archives to actually delve into the proper documentation that was handled by writers or by other officers, which would actually communicate it with other officers or back at base, back to the UK, to update the Wilmot and also other naval officers about their operations, including Malta. Next slide. Now, basically, this is a timeline overview. So what you see here is not what actually started. It's a timeline showing how all of the COPP groups developed as time passed by. You can see that COPP 1 initially was at Hailing Island. You had another group, COPP 2, in the Channel. But most importantly, what we'll be focusing on today is from COPP 3 till COPP 6, because COPP 3, COPP 4, 5, and 6 gradually reached Malta, and up till Operation Husky, there were losses. Some were disbanded, were amalgamated, then they were re-amalgamated with another group, and new fresh COPP teams 5 and 6 then from the UK were sent to Malta. COPPs 8, 9, and 10 eventually were in the process of completing training, and they started quite late, but then they were deployed to other theaters of war. So even the ones that gained experience from the operations from the island of Malta. But specifically, COPP 3 and 4 were the first groups that reached Malta. There were other COPP groups known as the Middle Eastern groups, we'll be mentioning soon, which were set up actually in the Middle East. They were unknown, but they were a small gang of COPP members which were dispatched early into the Mediterranean and later sent to Malta to join 3 and 4. But 5 and 6 to get a better idea of a successful outcome were the best reference point, because COPP 5 and 6 received much more training. They had more time allocated to experience the proper COPP operations back at base with regards to training and also equipment-wise. So one would gradually appreciate from zero up to a hero level, so to say. Now, with regards to training, this is basically, I couldn't eventually fit the whole training program, but I've tried to include a summary of what training would have involved, and as you can see, it was quite mind-blowing. This training program was assorted in such a way that especially the initial COPP members had to learn in a very short period of time, and one would appreciate that officers were allocated specific topics. Other ranks were allocated specific topics, army officers other topics, but again, trial and error showed that all COPP members somehow had to have an idea of everything, because if it was another rank accompanying an officer during an operation, or two officers, all of them had to be knowledgeable. They were on the field, they were at sea, they were at night operating close to an enemy beach, so somehow they needed to understand what was actually happening, and they needed to understand each other. One would appreciate that from the training program that Wilmot came up with, there was a lot being focused on the beaches, military, the beaches and the military. How to understand beaches, how to assess beaches, entryways, the obstacles, military obstacles, anything associated with beaches. Training was also given to understand landing craft, planning, an invasion, anything associated with beaches. So these men of COPP, once they're on the actual beach carrying out surveys and reconnaissance missions, they would eventually know what to look for. They would be able to identify obstacles. They would be able to identify beach entryways. So they went down to the last detail to actually pinpoint the right spot to land your troops at. And that's in fact the goal of COPP. Just simply that. One would say on paper it was quite simple. In practice it was a nightmare, because there were a lot of things that could go wrong. I'll be mentioning some of them. I'll be mentioning also experiences from an officer that was stationed in Malta, and things that went wrong, things that were quite risky, things that eventually led to the death of many officers, good officers in the Royal Navy. Eventually, besides the theoretical part, there was also the practical part, and they were also trained in combat, combined operations, combat, to defend themselves. They were equipped with weaponry to, of course, defend themselves. Ideally, they always operated in stealth mode, but if things would have gone wrong and they might have been spotted, they need to defend themselves. And in fact, the physical endurance part, we've mentioned Achnacarry, and there was also HMS Armadillo involved in the training program. There was also the physical part involved. One has to appreciate that all of this needs to be crammed in a very short period of time, especially for the first COPP members, and they also ended up trying to implement some of their training when they were even dispatched. But unfortunately, they did not have the means and time to do so, because they were rushed immediately onto their first missions. Okay, next slide. Now, we're going to go a bit into the equipment. So the equipment, I'm going to first start with the canoe. There's a whole story about the canoe that started on from Roger Courtney, Wilmot. You can, one of the most interesting parts of the canoe is how it got developed. A very, very, very long history. It would definitely need another podcast for itself. But I would recommend, I would mention the book about war canoes by, I can't recall his name, I might remember later on. There's a very good book. He's a UK expert. I think he's the only one in the UK that researched war canoes. And he has Quentin Rees, that's the guy, Quentin Rees.
Yeah.
Yeah. has been quite useful to us, even to source a Mark I star fall boat on the island. And basically, why the Mark I star? And why the star? Because previous to the Mark I star, there were other models being used, even initially early in Malta, that were more civilian type of canoes which are rugged enough, their canvas tore easily, they broke easily, and even though they were loaded through submarine forward hatches, torpedo hatches, they weren't ideal to utilize. But eventually, as time passed by, Wilmot banging his head against the wall to try and source the right people, the right materials, and companies to actually contract themselves to manufacture canoes specifically for COPP use, which were also, thanks to Courtney, tested out by the SBS. Again, Courtney supporting Wilmot in his project. It took time. But by mid-1943, the new model reached Malta, and it was started to be implemented much more effectively and very, very well received by COPP people. Why? Because the Mark I star, as you can see, I've presented some information, was spacious, rugged, very well structured, and very ideal to carry in a submarine, because once it was set up, it was loaded in whole, and it was disembarked whole out of the submarine. So it was very easy to load and disembark. That was very efficient, especially when you had a submarine surfaced in the middle of the night close to the enemy coast, and they needed to act fast. Ironically, the term foldboat is German, meaning a folding canoe, but eventually the folding part changed into a much more solid part. The Mark I star eventually later on in time developed into other models, but the most preferred model was the Mark I star. And in fact, you see it in all theaters of war practically, including the Mediterranean theater of war. Early on, I had mentioned the process associated with using the canoe to reach the enemy beaches. Basically, it consisted of two people, one acting as the surveyor and the other acting as the pilot. Usually would have a double-ended paddler or a single-ended paddler. The double-ended paddles were preferred more to the single-ended, and then there was enough space to carry all the necessary equipment, which I'll be mentioning later on in a separate slide. Besides the canoe, we'll be also mentioning, but I didn't go into detail with regards to this, chariots. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with chariots. Chariots were like a manned submersible torpedo, but they were specially modified not to carry the warhead. The Mark I model was used, but it was used for a short period of time from Malta in tandem with the canoes. It was a bit of a complicated process. If we have time, I might mention this later, or if some questions pop up. With regards to firearms, at the time, the Webley & Scott or the Enfield revolver was available. Unfortunately, there was one major issue. The stoppage power of the Webley & Scott compared to the Colt was quite poor. So COPP immediately preferred the Colt 1911 model as their favorite sidearm, especially if they might have experienced any problems on the beach whilst surveying or carrying out the beach reconnaissance. Through my research, I also managed to source that COPP were actually trying to utilize from the well-wrought pistol. The well-wrought pistol, for some of you, if you don't know, was a pistol created simply for its stealth purposes. Although it did not have enough stoppage power, but due to its stealth purposes, it was even being tested or being provided to COPP to try and test it out. But unfortunately, it did not work, simply because sand came in the way. Sand did not allow the well-wrought pistol to operate properly, so they immediately ditched the well-wrought and stuck to the Colt 1911. From a sidearm to the primary firearm, Colin first mentioned that the Sten Mark II was one of the most favorite for commandos, and in fact COPP adopted the Sten Mark II or the Thompson M1928. Eventually they carried their weapons in the canoe. So the canoe was quite filled up. In fact, blueprints, when I was researching, showed there was quite a lot of stuff running around. So they had to, know where everything was allocated, because at night you couldn't switch any form of light to try and search for your stuff. So everything had to be organized in such a way that you pick it up and utilize from it. You had the 9mm Sten and the .45 ACP Thompson. Both were quite utilized, but eventually not much deployed due to the unstealthy and noisy usage. So they were just there as a backup, or if required.
And a Thompson is a hell of a lot heavier as well, isn't it? I mean, if
yes, of course,
given the capability of a full boat.
But eventually, Paul, they were they're just present just in case something crops up. But yeah, with regards to weight, they had to be very careful because there was quite a lot of equipment present. I'll be covering this in another slide.
Okay, thank you.
The number 36 grenades, they weren't used eventually to hit the enemy, but as SUEs, as signal underwater explosives. They might have been noisy, but they could have been a lifesaver. Because one problem that COPP members experienced, especially during the initial recce missions and beach reconnaissance missions, was the rendezvous with the sub. After each mission, they had to agree on a time to rendezvous back with the sub to pick them up and take them back to Malta or to their sub or back to base. Some of COPP either lost track of time, they might hang up because the enemy might be near, and they eventually had to freeze in one specific location before continuing their journey, and sometimes the submarine would have lost contact. So one easy way to manage to trace them back or find their location was to drop a specially modified timed number 36 SUE grenade, and it would have been picked up by the sound picking equipment of a submarine. So he would have managed, or the captain would manage, to allocate them in such a way. Eventually, it was also a last resort because COPP, the ingenious people of COPP, managed to develop other equipment which served to operate at night in a much safer way. Now, another interesting, very interesting, in fact, and innovative part of the equipment list for COPP is the rubberized swimming suit. Wilmot, besides focusing on the canoe and getting the right canoe for COPP people, these COPP members had to have some form of protective gear, especially the surveyor, when disembarking from the canoe and swimming to shore. Why? Because eventually you could find anything in the way, from fish, from anything like any organisms or any form of plants that could go in your way. So the swimmer had to be protected. And in fact, very interesting history. I couldn't fit everything in this presentation. It would have been impossible. But eventually, when Wilmot came up with the model of the rubberized swimsuit, initially it presented with a lot of problems. In fact, it claimed the lives of some of COPP members because it leaked a lot of water, and some might have drowned, some might have had to go ashore and remain ashore because it put so much weight, and they ended up captured because of this. Eventually, as time passed by, C. Gorman, the manufacturer, improved the suit, and winter and also summer versions were developed. On the slide, I have an excerpt from Ian Trenauden's book describing the concept behind the swimmer's rubber suit. One could see that there was quite a lot of pockets and space where the COPP surveyor could carry a lot of equipment associated with beach surveying. I'm not going to go into all of that because I would never stop blabbering about the amount of nitty-gritty and tools they utilized. but they had writing pads, they had equipment to measure seabeds, all kind of stuff to present a beautiful geographical picture of the beaches they were surveying. Besides that, the Ursula jacket, which was utilized by the Royal Navy, was also sometimes implemented and utilized by COPP paddlers, by the COPP canoe operators, because it provided camouflage and it could be useful to the person acting as a pilot staying in the canoe, not to the swimmer. The swimmer eventually later continued to utilize from an upgraded version of the rubberized swimsuit. The famous Fairbairn and Sykes dagger knife, this was also provided to COPP members because it was popular with all combined operations personnel, or especially those personnel which operated behind enemy lines, including agents and special operation agents, and so COPP nonetheless were given the FNS fighting knife. They were trained to use the Fairbairn and Sykes, and it was carried each and every moment during the survey in case it might.
Oh, have we lost Kurt's connection there for a second?
I think I'm back on.
Okay,
Yes.
good.
Maybe you can repeat slightly about the Fairbairn and Sykes, Kurt.
Yes. Sorry again there. The FNS fighting knife, since at the time was popular, especially with combined operations personnel and also people which were operating under stealth or behind enemy lines or during special operations, COPP nonetheless also were given the FNS fighting knife, and it was carried each and every time during an operation because it proved quite lethal and effective for its size and for its design. And during their training program, all COPP members utilized from this knife and also utilized from this new idea of guerrilla warfare and hand-to-hand combat or close-quarter combat. This is the last slide from the equipment part. I'm going to mention some other important points with regards to equipment, especially from the pictures present. COPP, for the first time, put forward the use and tested, experimented. Well, it was a bit of an experimental piece of equipment, but it's quite interesting because I was amazed when I found out about this. They were actually utilizing from the first night vision technology and infrared technology. I have to gladly say that Colin knows quite a lot, in fact, about this piece of equipment because he actually owns one, which was known as the Tabby K. COPP were actually utilizing from a very well modernized piece of technology, utilizing from a modernized way of communicating stealthily. In fact, one of the pictures is showing an infrared piece which emits an infrared signal which would have allowed COPP members on the canoe to actually transmit stealthily without any form of sound, utilizing, you can say, modern day in physics, a signal to the submarine awaiting their return to pinpoint their exact location. They also could eventually visualize through night vision technology, which at the time some people might have think did not exist, but in fact it was in COPP's hands to visualize beaches from the canoes using night vision. So utilizing from this infrared technology, and even later on, not just only to rendezvous back with your submarine, but even as a guidance tool, allowed COPP to even further be put into other skilled jobs associated with beach landings during an invasion. It's good also to mention the bong stick, which was simply a piece of tool like a hammer and a stick which emitted sound, echo sounds, which was immersed in the water, and once rotated, instead of using SUEs, you would have used this bong stick to generate echo sounds in the water, which would have picked up by the submarine to mark the canoe's position. And besides these ingenious yet simple equipment, you had other life-saving, surviving equipment, which would have allowed COPP members to operate on enemy beaches. On the top part, there's an auger. It's just a simple tube, which would have allowed COPP surveyors to pick up beach sand samples, which would have then been analyzed by scientists at a lab, which would provide information for landing craft, weight-wise, etc., etc. This kind of stuff. So now COPP COPP have formed. Now they're being dispatched to the Mediterranean. After the Casablanca meeting, the Mediterranean all of a sudden was lit up on the Allied map as the next pathway, the next route into continuing the history and marking the history of World War II. And in fact, it was decided that the Allies would pass through Sicily. But eventually, this time, they were going to dispatch COPP to give them a proper understanding of the beach landing zones to ideally now strike the right landing parts of Sicily, of the Sicilian beaches, to successfully launch Operation Husky. And in fact, on the 8th of February, the Middle Eastern groups 1 and 2 had arrived from Malta, from Algiers. Mind you, these were the under-equipped and the under-trained groups, but eventually unknown to the other members of COPP, but eventually known to Wilmot, these reached Malta. They were raised and trained in Egypt at the start of 1943, but unfortunately they weren't enough experienced to carry beach reconnaissance. And in fact, one can see, I'm visualizing two tables which are showing the Middle East 1 and Middle East 2 groups, the commanding officers marked in blue. Nearly 3/4 of the officers, you can say, of the people forming COPP Middle East groups were lost. And they were lost either because they died, they drowned, or they were captured due to poor experience and poor training. Eventually, what happened because of these losses, and we'll be going through the dates and missions, I'll be summarizing what actually happened to the Middle Eastern groups, COPP 3 and 4, initially when on Malta, and eventually COPP 3 and COPP 4 were also dispatched immediately to Malta, to the Mediterranean. All of a sudden, the early groups of COPP now have been sent to Malta. Sicily is the main target. Sicily is the main focus. In fact, on the 8th of January, you had COPP 3 arriving in Malta, and COPP 4 was dispatched to the Mediterranean in Algiers, because initially it was thought having the Middle Eastern groups and COPP 3 would be enough. But in fact, I've marked them with set faces. You could see that COPP 3 also lost a lot of its members, and COPP 4 lost 2 of its members initially, because after the heavy losses of COPP 3 from Malta, COPP 4 was also sent to Malta, and they were all re-amalgamated. COPP 3 disbanded, and 4 was redesignated. As you can see, the losses were high, and one would say, well, okay, we lost officers, but these were experienced naval officers, as in Navy. They were experienced from naval part, even though they might not have been experienced COPP-wise. One would have questioned, how are we going to replace these experienced people? And in fact, there was a huge question mark when Wilmot faced these losses in initial missions and operations from Malta. In fact, he was questioned, would it be viable to keep on carrying missions using COPP? We've seen that they might be useful, but unfortunately the losses are high. What are we going to do? And in fact, Wilmot immediately sustained the current other COPP groups which were at Hailing Island with improved equipment, with improved training programs before being dispatched on official missions. Just to give an idea, basically, what happened on the 26th of February 1943, the COPP missions from Malta were kick-started. here I have some photos, thanks to a friend. I think he's present in this presentation, and also a friend of ours, Simon Hedge, which provided these photos showing groups of COPP stationed at Ain Tufiha, which I'll cover later on in the presentation. Basically, these photos from Peter Palmer's album are showing COPP 3 and 4 initially present in Malta. And one can see that I've managed to allocate and overlap the original photo
Nice.
original location, which is located in the northwest part of the island, which actually shows that these COPP members were stationed at Ain Tufiha and proved that their presence on the island was quite unknown at the time. But I'll discuss this later on. So I've tried to summarize the missions, and practically this is what happened on the 26th.
Just before you start about the missions, I just want to recap, because I've talked about all sorts of special forces on this show, going back, the SBS, we've done Alamo Scouts in the Pacific Theater. These guys have, from my limited understanding, just about the widest range of skills they have to have. I mean, even just simple things like getting a full boat off a submarine into a full boat and moving off in a full boat, that would take hours and hours of practice. Having been a canoeer myself back in my youth, they've got to have specialist weapons training. They've got to have communications. Yes. They've got to have the ability to do their job, the draftsman work, the sand samples, things like that. The navigation aspects, you're talking about infrared technology, night vision technology, working in small teams. And then just to add on to that, their missions are to provide information for massive landings that if their information ends up being wrong...
I have to admit, I myself was so confused whilst researching this part, because I couldn't believe that these officers, these men had to absorb so much, and even Wilmot himself admitted that there was so much that had to be absorbed in such a short period of time.
Yeah.
But they actually managed to put into practice. They proved themselves right. They proved.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of grouped them in with commandos, and you said they've had commando training, but commandos, in a sense, and this is no offense to Darren Little, who's watching, his grandfather was a commando. Commandos, in some ways, are kind of a blunt instrument. It's all about going in there. They're fit, they're tough, and they're good at killing the enemy. They're very good at that. But the technological skills these guys have on top of that taking them to an incredible league. I mean, the only thing I can think about that's equivalent to this is the navigation skills of those LRDG and SAS guys out in North Africa who could navigate their way over hundreds and hundreds of miles of desert. Other than that, these guys are extraordinary in the amount of skills they have to do it. And thank you, by the way, both of you, and also Rob Crane in the comments.
Rob has been quite supportive, because during COVID, whilst I had started my research, I came across Rob, and we collaborated quite closely together to expand the legacy of COPP, and also their innovative way how they operated. Which unfortunately, as I've said initially, their losses show that they had to grasp quite a lot. They had to learn quite a lot in a bad way through losing good men. But eventually it led within a short period of time, because by mid-1943, COPP, especially COPP 5 and 6, were so successful in their beach reconnaissance, up to a point that they even started carrying out guidance missions during the invasion itself, that they actually continued up till D-Day, and they've tested new stuff like the X-Craft, which were the midget submarines, which were being utilized solely by COPP. And Wilmot was so proud, to a point where he said, "We're the actual first people on the D-Day beaches rather than the invading force." Yeah. So they were so the loads of information that there's out there, and there was so much happening. Okay, and one would question how did all of this take place in 1943? How all of this stuff was actually being tested in 1943? All right, when one would think that technology might still have been primitive, but in fact one would find that there was quite a lot, and it was COPP which actually had put it to the test for the first time.
Yeah, no, brilliant stuff. But let's get to Sicily. I mean, it's fantastic stuff.
Yeah, so I was actually to a point, and where now we have the early groups being deployed, which is basically the Middle Eastern 1-2, COPP3, and COPP4 members are being deployed. You had on the 26th of February, you had Brand and Bob Smith, which unfortunately sourly experienced one of the worst scenarios a COPP could experience, because when they were deployed through HMS United Submarine to commence, and one thing before I continue, one needs to appreciate the pattern of the reconnaissance missions taking place on Sicily. One would initially find that the Allies tried to pinpoint all the surrounding parts of Sicily, but then all of a sudden the southeastern part of Sicily became the main interest point. And in fact, you would see once you take a look at the invasion maps of Sicily, the southeastern beaches were the main point selected. And this shows how COPP retrieved so much information to actually provide the right understanding of the right landing zones. So that pattern needs to be appreciated whilst I'm talking. So basically, when they were deployed to carry out a reconnaissance over Gela, which is basically marked on my map, another mission was also taking place during the same time by Lieutenant Hart and Folder, but unfortunately they were captured. But when Brand and Smith were carrying out their reconnaissance, they lost contact with their submarine, and they were literally stranded close to the enemy beaches, and their first choice was to literally paddle back to Malta, 120 kilometers. Literally, they paddled back to Malta, and after 37 hours of paddling, they were picked up 5 miles off the coast of Gozo. So that must have been a sour experience. But the stamina these men had was literally amazing. I mean, I wouldn't imagine myself paddling in a canoe, surviving on meager rations, rescue rations, just to paddle back to Malta, but they've managed. Later on, between the 4th and 5th March, you had Lieutenant Cooper, which was an officer in the Royal Navy. But as you can see, there was Captain Burbridge. He was part of the Royal Canadian Engineers. What you have to appreciate, the naval and the army part now collaborating together as 2 officers. Unfortunately, they were also lost through HMS Unbending. They went to the Schiaccia area, which is the upper part of the lower part, towards the northern part. Unfortunately, they were lost. Earlier on, between the 2nd and 3rd of March, you had another officer, Lieutenant Teacher, which was part of the Kudun Human Party, which we've mentioned in 1942 Operation Torch. He was carried on to form part of COPP. His experience was exhibited during. Unfortunately, he was lost whilst accompanying Lieutenant Cooper, and he was also lost. Unfortunately, more losses. As you can see now, COPP are focusing more on the southeastern part of Sicily, because now they're trying to pinpoint the right locations, the right beaches. You had Lieutenant Acock and Sub-Lieutenant Crossley, 3rd to 4th March. Further losses. The Cape of Passero, when the Cape of Passero, when it was being recce, initially wasn't the main point of interest, but then after a few days, COPP were now being focused, were now being centered on the southeastern part, the Syracuse, Avola, and the Cape of Passero area. And in fact, what happened is, after the losses of the Cock and Crossley, there were other further losses between the 8th and 9th. Davis and Maguire were also lost. So basically now you had 3/4 of the Middle Eastern groups wiped out. COPP3 was nearly wiped out. COPP4 was operating from Algiers on the Palermo area, but abandoned further missions on the Palermo area. And now we're focusing on the southeastern part. And it is in fact now from the April month onwards, I've tried to summarize them in the best way possible, that we start seeing better successful outcomes. In fact, COPP4 through HMS Unruffled started to recce the Syracuse and Avola area, and between 4th and 28th of April, quite a lot of information was being retrieved. But on the 27th of May, COPP, for the first time, deployed the use of chariots. And in fact, COPP6, which later joined COPP4 mid-1943, I'll be giving some more information about this later on, they were utilizing from the canoes and chariots combined together. Chariots basically were being used so they can assess the seabeds, so they can submerge themselves. It proved to be a bit difficult, a bit complicated, quite timely, so they've spent up till about end of May, beginning of June, till mainly the end of June, but they started limiting the use of chariots. And in fact, as you can see, chariots were being limited, and they still focused on the use of canoes. But basically, this offers a picture of what actually was happening. This is a summary, which basically shows the losses and also the initial recce missions. And as I've mentioned, you had COPP4 from Algiers, which carried out some Palermo missions, but then they were later abandoned due to the losses. And then we reached the end of the missions. Basically, you had high rates of losses. COPP3 disbanded, joined with COPP4. Eventually, you had COPP5 and COPP6 coming into the picture. And the successes of COPP5 and 6 came out eventually because of better equipment, better training. You had information already picked up by the previous COPP groups, so this was utilized by COPP5 and 6 to further continue the last few missions and reach the goal of invading Sicily. These are basically tables showing COPP5 and COPP6. You had COPP5 leaving for Malta May 1943, whilst COPP6 leaving for Malta April 1943. The groups were much more organized, much more trained. You had Lieutenant Stenberry, which commandeered Group 5, and Lieutenant Aymer, which commandeered Group 6, which also participated in the combined chariot and canoe recce missions. Ralph Stenberry luckily left us an autobiography, a detailed autobiography of his time in Malta, and most of my research, thankfully, was thanks to Lieutenant Ralph Stenberry, because he gave so much small details of information that helped us shed light on the operations of COPP from Malta. Much to say, little time. This basically is showing the COPP5 group with Stenberry as the CEO in the middle, and his group members at Hailing Island before being sent to Malta. Basically, what I'm showing in this slide is the last few missions that were being carried out by COPP5 to eventually forge and seal off Operation Husky for good. In fact, the end of June was dedicated to COPP5 successes, and it shows that the area, the southeastern part, where you had the river Cassibile, the Avola area, and also the southern part of Sicily being focused on by COPP5, pinpointed, color-coded the people involved with Lieutenant Stenberry to carry out these recce missions, which were eventually so much of a success that eventually led to the final information being retrieved by higher intelligence. Maybe that's where we can mention the intelligence to assess the data collected, to then eventually draft the beach landings for the invasion force. I couldn't not include some slides from Lieutenant Ralph Stenberry's book. This is my version of the book, where actually Ralph Stenberry gives quite a lot of detail. He was very sentimental, very emotional, very attached to Malta in his writings. He gives so much detail, even the perilous tasks associated with the reconnaissance mission itself, and also the dangers, such as, for example, the weather, the waves. They could have easily killed by the canoe members by literally turning them over. You had fishing boats armed with Italian or German soldiers patrolling the area. Searchlights all of a sudden beaming all over the sea surface when if they would hear a noise or an alarm was raised. All these kind of episodes, heart-thumping episodes that would have cost the lives of both early COPP and also COPs which would have carried out these missions. In fact, through his sketches, one would have been able to understand what these COPP members experienced. In this quote from his book, he's actually mentioning the first time that they've received the Mark I Star 4 boat in Malta. There was a war correspondent asking around, and he tried to eventually deter him from the site they were stationed, which was Ain Tufiha, to eventually, because the canoe at the time was quite top secret, no one knew of its presence. Here are more sketches which are basically showing how they would have rendezvoused with their submarine. All these episodes, which I don't have enough time to go into, but maybe in the near future we can, pick up some of these episodes to discuss. Besides his time in Malta, Lieutenant Stenberry, besides his descriptions of the missions, he also gives good description of Malta itself. In fact, he's a very good source in describing their accommodation at Ain Tufiha. We've seen pictures superimposed, original ones, over the buildings at Ain Tufiha, which I'll be mentioning some points on, which was basically their main Malta's HQ. They were stationed at these barracks secretly, but they were close to beaches, so they could actually put their canoes to practice. They could practice during their time off. And in fact, here you have the two main bases which COPP were stationed at. On the left, you have Ain Tufiha, modern day Ain Tufiha. Today, it's usually during these months, it's littered with tourists and with people at the beach. But top left, you can see the red circle marking the barracks, Ain Tufiha barracks, which were built basically before the Second World War, and they were utilized as training grounds. And later on, during 1943, COPP were stationed at these barracks until they were shifted to HMS Talbot. As you can see, strategically, Ain Tufiha's in a very ideal position for these men to take their canoes and practice down at the beach. The top picture is showing what we call, it's still standing nowadays, the Riviera Hotel, because during his stay at Ain Tufiha, Ralph Stenberry goes into much detail even in describing how they spend their off time shifting from the barracks to the Riviera Hotel, spending some of their time off within the area. But in 1943, Ain Tufiha barracks was requisitioned as a hospital, and they had to be moved to the HMS Talbot, which is basically located in Marsanshetto Harbour Part, which housed the Royal Navy submarines. Quite a bit uncomfortable as a living quarters, but they had to be relocated. And usually this was the base from which their main orders were issued. Now we're reaching the conclusive part. Colin will go a bit through the project which we have delved to. Eventually we were not enough happy about the information we've managed to research, so we decided to reconstruct a canoe, the Mark I Star 4 canoe, from an original canoe which was luckily located in Gozo.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that one in the photo there's probably not seaworthy. Just saying, I'm making a joke. Yeah. I would say it needs a little bit more covering. No. Kurt, that's been absolutely fantastic. People have been saying in the sidebar, the amount of information you're giving is extraordinary. And the reason there haven't been many questions coming, well, there have been questions coming in, is Rob Crane has been answering them as we go along. So pretty much we've covered a lot of it. But yeah, over to you, Colin.
Yes, thank you, Kurt. So basically, after Kurt conducted a lot of intense research about the historical part of the COPPs, and we had established what uniforms we were going to wear, that wasn't enough. We had to conclude now ourselves our final mission, and that was to reconstruct a Mark I Star canoe. In the beginning, we found it very difficult because we only had blueprints. However, luckily enough, as Kurt mentioned earlier on, we had information that there was a Mark I Star somewhere on the Maltese Islands, which we traced down. We found it in Gozo, in our sister island in Gozo. Luckily, I had a Gozotan friend who, through connections, we found out who this owner of this original Mark I Star canoe belonged to. Luckily, again, because when the odds are in your favor, it's all there. He accepted us to go to his garage. We went up on a Saturday afternoon. We took all the measurements we needed, and the project started from scratch. Although one of our members, Andreas Buscat, is not present, I must, from the bottom of my heart, thank him, because he was the mastermind and engineer for reconstructing and guiding us how to go about from scratch to detail. When I tell you to detail, to every inch that this Mark I Star is the way it was built. So here we have the first part, which is the skeleton part, the basic wood frame of the Mark I Star. We have 4 ribs on every side. We thought it was 4 ribs, then it eventually turned out that they had 3 ribs, but this way, having 4 ribs on every side, that makes it even stronger. Next slide, Kurt, please. Here we have a picture from the inside. As you can see, it's all wood, exactly as it was made way back in the 40s. And there you have the first layer of canvas. What I would like to point out, and this was the most challenging task, was that the nuts and bolts were casted from originals. So what we did was, our Gozotan friend, his name is Charlie, was sending me by post certain nuts and bolts, which he allowed us to cast and make replicas of, so that our canoe is a faithful reproduction to the minute detail. Next slide. Here we have the first layer of canvassing. That is our colleague and brother-in-arm Andreas, with the sewing machine, and sewing the first layer of canvas over the wooden skeleton. Next photo. Here we are testing the very basic of our four-boat. It was a bit of a wintry day. You can see me in the sea there. Besides being attentive that my colleagues do not topple over, I was being hounded by jellyfish. So I had the enemy around me as well. So not only the COPP had enemies, but we had enemies as well on the day. We were very happy with our first attempt, because not even a drop of water entered, and that wasn't even the first layer. So it was just the basic layer with the first coat, and that was proven to be very successful. Next slide. Here we have a more advanced stage. We have about 2 or 3 layers of canvas. We had the rubberized paint, and if you can see the brass fittings as well, those are restructured and recasted from originals. So I have to say, this is the final production of our canoe is a museum quality. We also, once it was all done, we took it down to sea and we had a photo shoot, and I can assure you it was a complete success. Next slide. Here you can have, before I hand over to Kurt, here you have the exactly an original compared to our reproduction, and you can see a lot of similarities. Kurt, I pass over to you. Maybe you can continue from this point on.
Reaching the end, I hope we didn't bore you with a lot of things. There was quite a lot. In fact, this was quite concise. This research is still ongoing, and it took quite a lot of my lifetime, so to say, but I'm quite happy with the outcome. Basically, also thanks again to who's presently even quite active in the chat, our friend from the UK, Rob Crane, also to Simon Hedge. This is another photo which actually is showing Palmer himself with an early model of the Mark I canoe, okay, but since it was early, it wasn't found to be much robust as the other picture, which is showing a much more advanced model, the Mark I Star canoe. But basically, I've included this slide because we've painted our canoe in a sea grayish color, which is basic color. But in fact, COPP did camouflage their canoes, and even from various sources, including Lieutenant Sturby's autobiography, they did name their canoes. Even from various literature sources, it shows that they did not only utilize from the canoes, but they added their own touch of life, so to say. And in fact, there are two examples, one late war and one in case of Malta, where you have the canoe in 1943, and you have salmon also written on a camouflaged canoe. But basically, this is to show that the canoes were also camouflaged to blend in, even though they were being utilized by night. I also would like to take and mention Quentin Rees's help to source the canoe, and also his book, which is filled with loads of information about wartime canoes. And eventually now we're going to close off this research, this presentation, basically because when COPP 5 and 6 committed their final energies to concluding beach reconnaissance from Malta, Lieutenant Stenberry was redeployed to continue missions post Sicily for the Italian campaign and for the Salerno and Anzio landings. Some missions were carried out from Malta, but eventually after Operation Husky, they focused more on the Italian mainland. Eventually, they continued their massive, huge legacy. So suddenly, COPP weren't desired, their needs weren't required, their idea fizzled off initially, but now they're on the forefront of the D-Day plans. Okay, they eventually made a name for themselves during the D-Day landings, because eventually Lieutenant Stenberry was a staff officer in D-Day. They've deployed reconnaissance missions using motorboats and also the use of the X-Craft midget submarines, which was unfortunately very uncomfortable, but they utilized from this new piece of technology to prove that COPP was more than just that. Besides that, both during D-Day and even during Husky itself, COPP acted as the guidance, so to say, people. Why? Because besides carrying out beach reconnaissance missions, they also acted as guide people. Why? How? They've installed special buoys that would immerse in the bottom, and then a special mechanism would trigger to emit a beacon once it reaches the surface to actually transmit a signal so it can be picked up by the main invading force and approach the right beach. They meet up with COPP, and COPP guide them to the right landing zone. This was also replicated on D-Day, and they supported also the Americans. But also, quite interestingly, okay, besides having the Americans being supported by COPP, the Americans also themselves came up with their own units, and one unit which can be closely associated with COPP was the UDT. I've seen the UDT being mentioned in the chat earlier, which is the Underwater Demolitions Team, which was different than COPP, but the concept was a bit similar because it was associated with demolishing beach obstacles to allow an approaching invading force to access enemy beaches much more easily. Eventually then, the Mark I Star, being the most popular canoe, continued to develop into other canoes, both material-wise and also technologically-wise. Something about the COPP Memorial. The COPP Memorial basically can be found at Hailing Island. It was erected on the 27th of September of 2012, dedicated to all COPP members by Countess Mountbatten. Here you can see bottom left Jim Boot. Jim Boot was the last surviving COPP member. Okay, he was present during the 2012 memorial setup, but died December 2022 at the age of 101. In fact, the patron of the COPP Memorial was, now he's the king of the United Kingdom, the former His Royal Highness Prince of Wales. I've put some links for the Hailing COPP Heroes Memorial on Facebook, and the link, which is the COPP Heroes website, which basically gives some information about all the COPP and also the Hailing Island Memorial. I love quotes, so I'm going to finish off with the quotes from two important figures within the Royal Navy, showing their utmost admiration and importance towards the dedicated missions carried out by COPP. And that's basically it. I hope you enjoyed it. There was quite a lot of information to churn, and now we're open for any questions.
Well, I mean, it's been superb. I say Rob has been answering a lot of the questions as we go along, but I think the main thing people were asking about when you were talking about the losses in the Sicily, you went through it, but the possibilities were drowning, searchlights, enemy ships.
Most of them drowned. Most of them were captured. Like, for example, there were instances where some officers, unfortunately, due to the leaking of the rubberized swimsuit, it was filled with so much water that they had to stay on the beach, and the sentries would have traced their whereabouts, and they would have been captured. What would have happened? There was an instance, in fact, what would have happened to your companion waiting out at sea in the canoe? He would have tried to rendezvous back with the ship. They would come across one of the fish boats armed with sentries, and they would also have been captured. So it was a lack of training. It was a lack of timing. It was a mix of everything. I cannot say it was just only training.
Yeah.
It could have been the weather. It could have been sheer unluckiness, literally.
Yeah. No, I think we've addressed most of the questions, and as we've been at it nearly 2 hours, I think it is time to bring it to an end. But we will extend the invitation to one of you, or both of you, or more of you, indeed, more of the group, to come back and talk about other aspects. Because as I was talking to you before you went live, I definitely want to do at least a week or two about Malta at some point, and we can do that. So, in terms of the group, the Living History, obviously you're welcome, new members. Many people can contact you about information. So we've got your links up there. Anything particularly as a Living History group you're looking for? I mean, are there research things? If there's anyone watching this, in terms of your research, any aspects that you're particularly needing help with that maybe some of our viewers might know the answer?
Can you repeat that, please?
Are there any particular research things that you might be looking for information for? We've got lots of people who are watching this, maybe watching it later on. If there's anything you're particularly looking for to aid your research that people can help out with,
we're basically looking for primary sources of information. Right. Maybe, like for example, Lieutenant Serber's book was quite an important source. There might be primary resources or other information. I mean, I've served the net quite a lot. Rob Crane can tell you, because I've been chatting quite a lot with him with regards to the topic, but we've tried to serve the internet. But if there may be information, or especially familiar links to members of COPP, which could offer information about, information which might have been kept by families and which is still not out there, which in fact happened during the research, that would be definitely helpful, because it would offer a primary insight to a COPP member, to a member.
Well, there's the kind of thing that can happen. I remember the first show I did with Dave Roberts about 30 AU. I received an email about a week later, and it's hard to understand sometimes the tone of an email, but it was, "Can you put me in contact with the person who presented this show on your channel?" And I was like, "Is that how I read it? Or is it, could you possibly put me in contact with them?" I didn't know the tone of the message. Long story short, it turned out to be the son of the first commander of 30 AU, who had an unpublished photo album, who got in contact with Dave and gave him all these incredible resources. So there is a track record of people watching these shows who then come forward with a gold mine of new information. So let's hope someone watching this right now, the next few days, had a COPP member as a family, and he's going to reach out and make contact. That would be fantastic, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's what happened. That's what happened with Peter's album. In fact, when Rob Crane had forwarded a copy of the pictures from Palmer's album. We were so happy because it helped us even strengthen our research and even further pinpoint Ain Tuffiha as their main initial base on the island. So information like that would definitely help.
Brilliant. Colin, you want to say something?
Pictures, Paul. Yes, and pictures for us is a very important source of information, so that we also can compare their locations where they were about in Malta.
Yeah. So photos, anything. So anyone watching this, diaries, photos, personal connections with serving members, or indeed anybody who knew anything. Maybe they were in another aspect of the Navy, but they have information about COPP units that would be gratefully received. So we'll leave it at that. So Kurt, Colin, thank you very much. Viewers, I will join you all again tomorrow. We're back into Normandy tomorrow with a great story about a lost piece of equipment. And then we've got Peter Hart doing something about the foot sloggers in Italy, the Durham Light Infantry, and various things coming your way this week, including one more Husky show. We've got Steve coming back on to do the show that's postponed from last week about the 1st Division in Jailer. So there we are. Thank you very much, Kurt. Thank you very much, viewers. I will see you all again next time. It's Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.